Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Pei Daled. We're going to start today's daf. Shavua Tov to everyone, and we're going to start today's daf with a review of yesterday's because today, the beginning of today's daf, is all based on the different approaches that we saw yesterday. So let's do a quick review of the different approaches, and we have a study guide today. So we have Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Rabbi Akiva. They all, it wasn't set up as a five-way debate, but it's clearly a five-way debate about which items that if they went on the altar, they don't need to come off the altar. We're going to deal with two big issues today. One is from yesterday, which is which things that went on the altar, which types of items, either things that burn by the fire, right, that get burnt on the altar, maybe things that just go on the altar, but not necessarily get burned, like the blood, like the libations. Then we had this a little bit different than all the other opinions, which is Rabbi Shimon, who just basically wanted to talk about these libations that go together with the sacrifice. And because they're secondary to the sacrifice, they're treated independently, and they don't get this whole issue of imalu lo yardu. If they go up on the altar, they don't come off. That's kind of not relevant to them. And then we have another debate between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva, which obviously in the big scheme of things related to this whole debate, which is it only animals or anything that can be offered as a burnt offering, which would include animals and birds, according to Rabbi Akiva. So those are five opinions about which types of items that go on the altar is this halakha relevant to. The second part of today's daf is going to be talking about which types of disqualifications fit this category and which disqualifications are so disqualified that we're not going to be able to put them on the altar. Now, this whole thing really raises a whole question as to how does this whole thing work? Why, if things are disqualified, are we letting them go on the altar in the first place, right? We're not supposed to put them there, but if we did, they stay there. And there's Alana Steinhain's Shiur and Din and Daf this week. You can find our Hadran's website, or you can find it in a podcast on the Beyond the Daf podcast. Really what she dealt with this week was what's the idea behind this, okay? And different approaches to understanding what exactly is going on here. So if you're interested, which we're always interested in kind of understand the idea behind it, right? What's really the idea behind it? And what are the, as we always call it, the nafkaminas, what are the relevant examples? Where is it going to be relevant, whether you view it in this way or a different way? Okay, so that's an interesting place to go to really understand this halacha better. Now, what we saw at the end of the daf was kind of an interesting thing. The Gemara is even going to ask after, like, what are you trying to do here? Which is try to figure out, make sense and order out of all these approaches. In what cases would these agree that it doesn't? In what cases would they switch their position? In that case, it actually goes off. You have to take it down or not. Okay, so where are there differences of opinion, halachically, and practical examples between the different opinions? So we had the kamatzim, right, which is the kometz that you take from, that was already sanctified in a vessel. So since the kometz gets burned on the altar and goes on the altar and isn't a libation that goes with korban, so the first three opinions are all going to say, leave it on. But it's not an animal, it's not a bird, it's not a burnt offering, so, right, not an ola, so they would come off. Then we started with Reish Lakish. Okay, so let's start with Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish is going to give 4 examples. Okay, mincha ba b'fnei atzma, if you have a mincha offering that you bring on your own, so it's not going to come off according to the first 3 opinions, because also part of it gets burnt on the fire, even though the whole thing doesn't, but part of it gets burnt on the fire. And we're going to talk about this, but a mincha ba b'fnei atzma, 1 second. Yeah. The mincha that comes on its own actually is talking about a mincha that gets burned, because it's not the kometz, it's the mincha. That you could theoretically, and we're going to talk about this in a bit, you could bring a mincha that completely gets burned on the altar. And that's why Rabbi Yeshua will say it's right way to get burned again. Just to be very clear, all these cases are, let's say, a mincha that comes on its own, that, again, doesn't go with a korban. Okay, there's different, maybe I should even just explain it right now. There's different kinds of offerings that come. There's mincha offerings that a bit gets burned and the rest gets eaten by the kohen. There's minchas that get completely burned. Those are the minchat nesachim, for example. Okay, also a kohen who brings a mincha offering as a voluntary offering, the whole thing gets burned. It says kalil. Okay, the whole thing gets burned, but normally it doesn't. Okay, most mincha offerings the individuals offer does not. But it sounds like from here there could be a mincha offering that someone offers and burns it completely, and that's why Rabbi Yeshua will say that gets burned. Rabban Gamliel says, well, that goes on the altar. Rabbi Shimon says, well, it's not a libation that's secondary to the sacrifice. So all of them would agree that if it were disqualified, it would not come off. And Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Kiva would say, well, it's not animals, it's not birds, so you would have to take it off. Okay, next category. So now we're going to read it inside because that we already did yesterday. Mincha haba ima zevach. Okay, if you have a mincha that comes with the sacrifice. So now we know which is the big one that's going to change here, Rabbi Shimon. Because Rabbi Shimon says if it goes with the offering, well, then we don't leave it on the altar if you accidentally put it on. So the divrei Rabban Gamliel of Rabbi Yeshua lo tered, because they both, again, this mincha gets burned, the one that goes with the offering, completely. So, again, it gets burned, so don't take it off. And that's Rabbi Yeshua. And according to Rabban Gamliel, it goes on the altar, so it's on. But everyone else is going to say it goes off, because according to Rabbi Shimon, it's secondary to the korban. According to Rabbi Yossi Glili, it's not an animal. According to Rabbi Kiva, it's not a bird. Okay, next category. Nisachim haba'im b'fnei atzman. L'divrei kulan yirdu. Again, every time they say kulam, it doesn't really mean kulam, but everyone except for l'divrei Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Yeshua, lo yirdu. Okay, let's go through. Nisachim, libations that come on their own. Those are things like wine that you pour on the altar, so they don't get burned. So according to the first opinion, Rabbi Yeshua, it's not something that gets burned, it's going to come off the fire. According to Rabban Gamliel, it goes on the altar, so it stays. Rabbi Shimon, what does he say? They're nisachim that come on their own, not with the korban. So he's going to say if you bring a libation onto the altar, so, and again, a disqualified one, you're not going to take it off because it didn't come with the korban. His only issue is if it comes with the korban, it's secondary to the sacrifice. It was a voluntary one that you offered on your own. Nisachim and then the last two opinions, again, obviously, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Kiva say it has to be animals or it has to be birds. It's not birds, it's not animals. So they're going to say, so again, everyone except the two middle opinions, Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Shimon, are going to say this has to come off. And the last one, which you'll see it's highlighted in another 3 minutes, you'll understand why. Nisachim haba'im ima zevach, if it comes with the sacrifice, so you already know Rabbi Shimon's going to say off, right? And l'divrei kulam yirdu, l'divrei Rabban Gamliel lechude lo yirdu. And this one we get to this opinion where one guy stands alone. Only Rabban Gamliel is going to say this can stay on the altar. Because remember what he says? Anything that's supposed to go on the altar. And this is supposed to go on the altar, right? So that can stay. But everybody else thinks this doesn't get burned. It doesn't. It's a corollary. It's secondary to the sacrifice, according to Rabbi Shimon, and it's not an animal. It's not a bird, according to the last two, Rabbi Yossi Glili and Rabbi Kiva. Okay, that's our long list of Reish Lakish, which actually isn't terribly complicated. It's a little bit. You have to think everything through, and it's a good review. But the Gemara is a little surprised by what Reish Lakish does, and the Gemara says pshita. Isn't this obvious what he said? No, you could tell me it is obvious. It isn't obvious, right? I don't know how you want to call it because you did have to spell everything out and think about it. But actually, everyone, if you really sat on it, you can come to this conclusion. So what's he trying to tell us? So the first thought the Gemara has is maybe it's coming for the first case. Mincha ba b'fnei atzma itzrichale. This mincha offering that you bring on its own, that you burn completely, maybe that's his whole chidush. Uchida Rava, Da'ama Rava, and he says like Rava now. Reish Lakish is second generation in Israel, Rava is fourth generation in Babylonia. So it's not like saying Reish Lakish is holding like Rava. It's saying that, well, we're Babylonia, we know Rava's approach. We're going to say that Reish Lakish in Israel must have been holding by the same approach and must have been wanting to tell us what Rava said, same thing, which is mitnadev adam minchat nesachim b'chol yom. Anybody who wants can bring a mincha offering that gets burned completely. Okay, and that's what he was trying to tell us. Okay, that's option one. But the Gemara is going to say, if that's what he wanted to tell us, why would he tell us in this way? Okay, it's true that you could figure that out from what we just said. But why don't you just nishmina kiderava? Why didn't he just make a statement like Rava? If you want, you could bring a voluntary offering every day. So that's a little bit difficult. So the answer a different answer, which is, it's the last one. And that's why I highlighted in yellow. Nisachim haba'im im hazevach itzri chalei. And what he really wanted to tell us is, specifically, this is why I highlighted and put it under Rabbi Shimon, because really what he wanted to tell us, if the nisachim come with the korban, Rabbi Shimon's going to say yerdu. Now you would have said, isn't that obvious? Well, we're going to say like this. There's two types of ways that you could bring libations with your sacrifice. Okay? One way is you could bring it at the same time you're doing your sacrifice. Another way is that you could actually push it off up to 10 days and bring it. Now the sacrifice has to be brought that day. We all know that. Otherwise, we're going to talk about this later today. It's called lan. You left it overnight and it's disqualified. But the libations that if I bring a sacrifice on Sunday, I have up to 10 days to bring the libations. So maybe Rabbi Shimon is going to distinguish between libations that are brought on the day the korban comes, and then they're obviously secondary to the korban, or libations that come later in the week. So let's read inside. To kamakarev lehu lemachar uliyoma, it should be ochara, okay, yoma acher, a different day. So you might have thought that it needs to tell us that the Zevachim that come with the nisachim that come with the korban, these libations, which you sacrifice, you could theoretically sacrifice the next day or the day after. You might have thought, since we learned this drasha, minchatam v'nizkehem balayla, minchatam v'nizkehem lemachar. Okay, the pasuk is minchatam v'nizkehem, right? We know that from in Musaf, we say that all the time, and the minachot that go with it, and the nisachim that go with it. There's all these things that are added to these basic korbanot. But the drasha is, you can do it at night, you can do it tomorrow. So now you might have thought that if you do them at night when you can't bring the korban anymore, or you bring them the next day where you can't bring the korban anymore, you might have thought they're like nisachim haba'im b'fnei atzmam damu. Maybe they're just like libations that are offered on their own. And maybe Rabbi Shimon would say this is not an exception to the rule because they're actually separated from the korban because you're bringing them on a completely different day. And if they were to get disqualified, maybe you really could, and then put on the altar, maybe you could actually leave them. So, and Mo de Rabbi Shimon de lo yerdu. Maybe he agrees with the other opinions that you wouldn't take it off. Kamash malan. That's why you needed to come and say no. Rabbi Shimon, that's why Reish Lakish came and said, libations that come with the korban, he's always going to say yerdu. If they were disqualified and you put them on the altar, you have to take them off. They're not allowed to stay on the altar at all. Okay, so that was an end of the first part of today, which is continuation of yesterday, these 5 different opinions, and like I said, Reish Lakish kind of fleshing out all different situations where these groups of rabbis would disagree in different kind of manners, right? This one, each case we had a bit of a different who would agree with who about what. And then the Gemara kind of saying, well, why are you telling us this now? Theoretically, Reish Lakish could just be telling us to organize the sugya. It's always nice to organize things in that manner. Or, like the Gemara concludes, he must be telling you because he wants to tell you something else. And in the end, we said it must be not that you can voluntarily offer a meal offering that gets completely burnt, but that the libations, when you bring the libations that go with the korban, even if you bring them on a completely different day, they're still considered secondary to the korban. And Rabbi Shimon would still say what he says, which is these are not in the category of items that stay on the altar if you accidentally put them on once they were disqualified. Okay, now we're going to go to the Mishnah that talks about which types of disqualifications are we talking about. So first it was which items. Now it's which types of disqualifications. If they went on the altar, they stay, and if not, not. What's nice about getting toward the end anyway, we're not really at the end yet, but we're definitely we've done more of this Masechet than we haven't, is that we get to some sugyas that repeat themselves, and also concepts that repeat themselves, and ideas that repeat themselves. So today we're going to have a bunch of those. Elu imalu lo yirdu. Halan v'hayotze v'tamei. Okay, so all these things, if they went on the altar, they don't come down. What are they? Lan, if it was left overnight. Or yotze, it left the azara. Okay, we know all these are disqualifications. You can't leave them overnight. You can't take them out of the azara. Tamei, impure, right? These are all things that if it happens, you do not put this on the altar. However, if you did anyway, or someone came along and put it on the altar, putting just means, actually, remember we had this question also, is putting it on the ramp like putting it on the altar? And it just means putting it there. It doesn't mean putting it on the fire. Okay, right? That would be harder to actually take it off the fire, right? Try to figure how to do that. We just mean if it went already on the altar, like someone carried it up and brought it up to the altar. And for those who say the ramp is even like the altar, for certain things it is. So that would also be even just going up the ramp. It would already mean, again, there's, like I said, in Alana's shir, you'll hear the two different ways of understanding this, but either like we saw, so that like it becomes lachmei mizbeach, like that mizbeach almost takes it under its wings and sort of absorbs it into the mizbeach, and now it's sanctified, or or it could be a different approach of, well, you started a process, so we just let you continue. Okay, but for whatever reason, these items, okay, they're disqualified, but if somebody put them there, they would stay. Okay, now we get to pigul. Okay, all the way back to the beginning of the Masechet. If you had a pigul thought while you were doing it, disqualify the korban. You're not supposed to put it on the altar at this point, but if you did, it stays. Shekiblu dama psulin v'zarku et damo. Who accepts the blood? Only a kosher kohen. What if it was a non-kosher? We're going to see later. This means actually like an impure kohen. Okay, it doesn't mean a non-kohen at all, even though theoretically maybe it could, but we'll see in the Gemara later today that they mean a kohen who's impure. Or Kohen is impure, sprinkled the blood. So either accepted the blood, walked the blood, sprinkled the blood. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, okay, now we have another opinion here. Shenishchat balayla v'nishpach dama v'yatsa dama chutz l'klaim imalta tered. He has a chumrah by three things. One is if you slaughter the animal at night, which you're not allowed to do. And none of these you're allowed to do. But he has these three exceptions. We're going to talk about it later where he gets it from. Nishpach dama, if the blood spills on the floor, okay, or yatsa dama chutz l'klaim, or if the blood went out of the azara. Okay, he's more strict with the blood than he is with the meat, because remember, the blood is the key part of the whole korban. So if then you went ahead and did the korban the way you were supposed to and put it on the altar, off. Okay, we make you take it off. Rabbi Shimon Omer lo tered. He doesn't agree about these three things. He says, no, these three things are no different than all the others. His distinction is, and this is also something we saw in an earlier sugya, Rabbi Shimon Omer, kol shepsulo b'kodesh, ha-kodesh mekablo. Lo haya psulo b'kodesh, and ha-kodesh mekablo. What's the determining factor? Is the psul, is the disqualification in the kodesh. Okay, what does this mean? So Rashi says what it means is if the psul is in the azara, if you brought it into the azara and it was totally fine, and in the azara something happened to it, like it became impure, like you took it out of the azara, like one of these things, but it was already in the azara, and when it got into the azara it was fine, and then it got disqualified through something happening there. If you remember, we had this with the small, if it was done with the left hand, if it was, if there was we had a whole thing about this and compared to this sugya. If that happens, then we leave it on the altar. Tosfot says psul b'kodesh means it got disqualified not after it went to the azara, but if it was after it was sanctified in a sanctified vessel, which is a later stage than just coming into the azara. Okay, but anyway, there's a debate exactly what this psul b'kodesh is. But if the psul happened b'kodesh, hakodesh mekablo, since it was already sanctified or already in the azara, we get to keep it on the mizbeach, again, only if it was accidentally put there. Lo haya psulo b'kodesh, but if it was disqualified even before it got here, ein hakodesh mekablo, then it wouldn't accept it. Okay, so now we want some examples. Eluhen shayu psulam b'kodesh, shelo hayu psulam b'kodesh. Here are things. Now we're going to tell you what's not in this category. What are items that if you put them on the altar, you must take them off because they were already disqualified before they even got there. So, rovea v'nirba, an animal that engaged in bestiality, either initiated or it was initiated to the animal. They were passive. Or hamuktzah v'ne'avad, these are avodah zarah, animals that were either designated for idol worship or were used for idol worship. Ha'etnan v'hamechir, those are two things that always go together because they're together in the pasuk, even though they're completely different things. But one is a gift given to a prostitute, and one is an item sold for a dog. Vakilayim, mixed animals, like an animal created from two different animals. You're not allowed to use the korban. Treifa, an animal that is not kosher because they're going to die within 12 months. That's a treifa. And hayotze dofen, and an animal that's not born in a normal birth, but a C-section kind of birth, okay, for an animal. Because it says, when it talks about animals brought for sacrifice, it says, ki yivaled, it is born. So it has to be born in a natural manner. Uba'alei mumim, and the last on the list, blemished animals. So this category makes a lot of sense. These animals were never really good to be brought as sacrifices, so, or maybe at some point, but certainly not before they were brought to the temple. They were already disqualified. So if they go on the altar, you have to take them down. Rabbi Akiva machshir b'ba'alei mumim. He disagrees about blemished animals. Later we'll see that he's talking about only dukan shaba'ayin, right? This type of blemish in the eye that we said is not as severe a blemish. Okay, but we'll put that aside for right now because we don't know that yet. Rabbi Chanina skan kohanim omer. Okay, the Rabbi Chanina, who is the skan of the kohanim. Okay, so it sounds like he lived in the temple period. He was the second in charge to the Kohen, and he often comes up in sugyas about the temple. And he basically testifies. He says, my father would push off the animals that were blemished animals from the altar. It sounds like he's disagreeing with Rabbi Akiva and saying, I don't know what you're talking about. Right? My father actually pushed them off with his own hand and knocked them off the altar if they were put on. Now the Mishnah continues and says, okay, so we're done with our debate about what exactly is in, what is out. But again, Rabbi Shimon has a very clear distinction. Psul b'kodesh versus not psul b'kodesh. If it was disqualified before it got sanctified, whatever that means, Rashi Tosfot, but disqualified before, can't go on the altar, and if it does, you have to take it off. Whereas the other category, if it got disqualified in the kodesh, then we say, okay, well, if you put it, you shouldn't put it on, but if it got on, we're going to leave it on the altar. And then Rabbi Yehuda had 3 exceptions to that rule. He basically accepts Rabbi Shimon, or at least all the cases Rabbi Shimon said he agrees with, but except for 3. He says there's 3 cases where I make an exception. These have to come off. Then the Mishnah says, just like kashem she'im alu lo yardu, just like if they went on, they don't come down. Kach im yardu lo ya'alu. But if, okay, so here we have a situation. We're not supposed to put it on the altar. Somebody put it on the altar. In the case of the ones that are supposed to stay. It's supposed to stay. But if someone then took it off, like some season says, what did someone just do? And they quickly pull it off. Or falls off the altar. It's possible, right? The altar's high up. It could be, it's on the edge. Falls off the altar. Lo ya'alu. Don't put it back on. Okay, so in a sense, right, especially if we say, the Mizbeach kind of, it becomes the property of the Mizbeach, like the Mizbeach sanctifies it, you would think maybe that means it's now totally fine. But no, if you go with like the process, kind of, you started a process, well, now the process broke in the middle, so, leave it at, don't start putting it back on. So it shows that there's a bit of a murky area, like what exactly is going on here. That's why Alana Shir is helpful, because it's very hard to understand the nuances of how this halacha works exactly. If the animal was still alive, everybody would agree that you bring the animal off. And here's an example. If a korban ola, for example, was brought up to the top of the altar while the animal was still alive, it could be also the animal just walked up to the altar, and okay, tered, you bring that animal down. But if for whatever reason, shachata b'rosh mizbeach, someone decides to slaughter it at the top of the altar. Remember, we had a whole sugya that you can actually use the mizbeach, right? We had a whole question: is the mizbeach considered safon for the ones that have to be done in the safon, or is only the northern part of the altar considered safon? But we learned you could actually sacrifice on top of the altar. The rabbis actually discouraged people from doing this. They were worried that the animal might defecate while slaughtering, and that would be kind of disgusting for that to happen at the top of the altar. Like at least in the designated slaughtering area in the Azara, we could have it there, but not at the top of the altar. But anyway, they discourage people from doing this. On the other hand, it is a kosher place, but according to Torah law, it says Vasita olotecha uzvachecha, right? You could do your olot here on the top of the mizbeach. So if the animal goes up alive and someone slaughters it, now, you'll understand why they said ola, because this would really be true for anything. The slaughtering would be a kosher slaughter, because any animal, not just any sacrifice, not just a burnt offering. But the burnt offering has certain halachot that you have to do what's called hefshet and nituach. You have to take off the hide and then cut it into pieces, so that if you already did the slaughtering on the top of the altar, again, we're talking about an ola that was disqualified. It wasn't, right, the animal went up anyway, it got cut up, right, it got slaughtered there. So you finish the process at the top of this point, okay? Yafshif v'yenatcheha bimkoma. You do it right there where it is. That's a kind of a side point. Now we're going to go into a braita, and that's going to be the majority of our daf today. You'll see Amud Bet is very short. It's kind of a simple daf. We're now going to have a braita that goes through Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, and shows where do Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon get their opinions from the text. Okay, classic example where we have a Mishnah with halachot, and then we have a Midrash halacha which connects it to the psukim. You're going to see that the connection to the psukim is a little bit weak, right? This shouldn't bother us because we always have this question: what came first, the halacha or the drasha? Right? Sometimes it's the drasha and the halacha comes out of the drasha. Sometimes it was they knew the halacha and then they try to fit it into the psukim. This looks a little bit more like that type because it's hard to say that this is the only way to read the psukim. First of all, it's obviously not the only way. There's a machloket. So Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer. So here starts our braita. Zot hi ha'olah. Hari elu shlosha miyutim. You might remember this. Okay, this came up in the beginning of the Masechet where we said there was some braita and we were trying to raise a difficulty, I think, and say that braita is Rabbi Yehuda. How do we know it's Rabbi Yehuda? Because he does 3 miyutim in this other sugya, and that's what he does here, where he says, oh, we have 3 words, and that says, oh, not this, not that, not that. They're trying to exclude 3 halachot, and he does that in our sugya, and here's our sugya. So Rabbi Yehuda says, we're now in the pasuk in Vayikra chapter 6, verse 2. Savat Aaron ve'panav lemor, command Aaron in a sense to say, Zot Torah ha'olah, these are the rules for the olah. Hi ha'olah mukda al mizbeach. These are the rules for the korban olah. This is what goes up on the pyre, on the altar. Now, there's a word zot. This is, okay, first of all, you have to understand, this is where they get hi ha'olah. Once it goes up, it stays up. Okay? So, but we're going to say, well, not everything though, because it says zot, this is. It says he, this specifically, and ha'olah is the ha'yidiyah, the burnt offering. So all those 3 words are saying, well, not everything. So what is he going to exclude from here? Harei elu shlosha miyutim. Now, it's not clear as why specifically these 3. Okay, but he has 3 miyutim. Prat l'nishchata b'layla, if it was slaughtered at night. Shenishbach damad, the blood spilled on the ground. Right, this is when it spills directly from the ground before it goes into the vessel. V'shiyatza damachutz l'klaim, or the blood left the azara. Sh'im alta, if we then put this on the altar, tered. Okay, it would have to come off. Rabbi Shimon Omer, olah. Now he's going to darshan this pasuk differently. He says the word olah, ein li ela olah kshera. This sounds like a real korban, right? The simple reading of the pasuk is, it's the burnt offering that goes on, a perfectly good burnt offering. Where do we get all of a sudden that this includes disqualified items? Minayin l'rabot. So the first 3 they mention are the 3 that Rabbi Akiva excludes, that he doesn't exclude. And then it goes through the list of all the ones Rabbi Akiva agrees about. V'halan, v'hayotze, v'tameh, the one that was left overnight, the one that left, right, the meat left, or the imurim left, right, the parts that aren't right besides the blood, because we already talked about the blood. Hatameh, impure. It got impure. Shenishchat chutz zmano v'chutz l'mkomo, pigul. Okay, now you're going to see some examples that weren't mentioned in the Mishnah. Well, we have one more that was mentioned in the Mishnah. Shekiblu psulim v'zarku et hamo. The wrong kohanim took the blood and threw it. Hanitanim lemata shenitanan lemala. Now we get to all sorts of other cases that weren't mentioned in our Mishnah. So besides that this braita connects it to the psukim, the braita also adds some more cases. So blood that was supposed to be below that you brought on above, or lemala shenitanan lemata, where it was supposed to be below, supposed to be above and you put it below. Hanitanim bachut shenitanan b'fnim, was supposed to be on the outer altar and you brought it into the inner altar in the sanctuary. Or in the heichal, bifnim shenatam b'chutz was supposed to be brought in the heichal, and you brought it into the outer altar. U pesach v'chatat shechatan shelo lishman. Back to our first Mishnah, right? The 2 that are completely disqualified, the pesach and the chatat that you did shelo lishman. Those are the 2 cases that are completely disqualified. Even those, though, if somebody put the parts on the altar or did the blood on the altar, we don't take it off, okay? Or they walked up to the altar, right? And with the blood, we say, you're already there, okay. You can continue. Talmud Lama, where does he get it from? Torat ha'olah. So remember, he started by saying it says olah. That might have meant only a burnt offering that's good and any other offering that's good. But because it says Torat ha'olah, whenever it says the word Torata has something, which it says a lot, like Zot Torata Mitzorah, Zot Torata, it says it a lot, Zot Torata Chatat. It wants to tell you the Torah Achad L'Kol Ha'olot, okay? What it teaches you is it has the same rule for anything. Now here they're using the word olah, not just as burnt offering, but that goes up, the literal meaning of olah. Riba Torah Achat Lechol Ha'olim. Anything that gets brought up to the altar, she'im alu lo yardu, that if it went up, we don't take it off. Okay, that's his big chidush. And again, Rabbi Yehuda agrees with him in general, just not in 3 cases. Now comes the exceptions. Wait, if everything that goes up shouldn't come off, then what about the other ones that we know were excluded? Remember, all the ones that imsula b'kodesh, that were disqualified before. Yachol shani marbeh haroveh v'hanirba, the animals engaged in bestiality. Hamuktzah v'haneva, the ones designated or used for idol worship. Etnanu machir, the gift for the prostitute or the item that was sold for a dog. Kilayim, mixed breeds of animals. Treifa, the one who was sick before it was killed, before it was slaughtered. Yotzei dofen, born by C-section. Talmud Lomal, zot. Because it says the word zot, he does think there's some mi'ut, some exclusionary term here in the pasuk, and that teaches you all of these. Obvious question, okay, why those in, those out, right? We need to figure out. Well, achar sheriba katuv turning out amud bet umi'et, since it both added, expanded by the word olah, anything that goes up, right? Anything that goes up on the altar, but also limited zot. Marbe'aniat elu shaya psulam b'kodesh umotzianiat elu shalo haya psulam b'kodesh. When I was in school, right, they always tell you never define something by its own definition, right, using the words of it. This is kind of like, why those, not those? Well, because that's the, you have to remember, in the Mishnah, they didn't yet, in the braita, they didn't yet tell you that categorization. So now they're telling you the categorization. And what they're saying is, so it's not exactly as unfair as I said, because what it's saying is, well, those all got disqualified later, right, once they were already sanctified. So we could say those were already sanctified, leave them on the altar. But the ones that weren't sanctified, that really is the definition. It's the explanation as to why. Things that were disqualified before they even were sanctified, they're much less sanctified because they never really could have gotten sanctified because they were already disqualified from the beginning. Those are going to stay off. And therefore, by giving the name to the by giving it a categorization, that's actually the explanation. We already read the Mishnah. We kind of wanted to know why are those that are psul coach, why is that the distinction? But the Gemara is saying that's a very, the braita here is saying that's a very clear distinction. It makes a lot of sense. Rabbi Yehuda, ma'itera mihacha. Now, where does Rabbi Yehuda get? Now, it's interesting. Rabbi Yehuda has 3 biyutim, but now what they're going to say is, how do we know those were the 3 excluded? Because it's obvious that the others are going to be included. In other words, and then we're left with, if he has 3 miyutim, it's going to take out those 3 cases. So how's he going to get it? And this actually is a sugya we saw. Where did we see this? I'll remind you. On Daf Nun Aleph, if you remember, in those dapim there, Nun Aleph, and in the dapim, I think just after, just before, I don't remember, but I remember that page especially, had all the drashot, like hekesh on a hekesh, and exer shava on exer shava, right? And can you learn this for kodshim, exer shava and exer shava, and this on that, and that. This is one of them we brought, and you'll see if I don't know if you remember this one, but you might remember the beginning because it's a little bit of a rhyme. So Rabbi Yehuda learns it from here. Mipnei ma amru lan bedam kasher. How do you know that lan bedam is kasher? That if it was left overnight in the blood, it can stay on. Shaharei lan kasher bi'imurim. Because in the imurim, if you do it with the fatty parts, they're supposed to be burnt on the altar, and you leave them overnight, and then again, what does this mean? If you then put on the altar, which you're not supposed to, it would be fine. Okay, so we're going to go like this. Now, we don't know yet why that is okay. It's going to be, first we're going to have to do this in stages. The reason why lam bedam, he agrees with Rabbi Shimon about, is because lam bi'imurim is kasher. Now, you could think there would be a reason to be more strict about the blood, but his point is, if the blood is left overnight and then you accidentally put it on the altar, we'll leave it, because if you did the same thing with the fatty parts, you would obviously be able to leave it. Why obviously would you be able to leave it? Well, lam bi'imurim kasher, sharei kasher bebasal. Well, we're going to make a jump. Blood, we're going to learn from imurim. Imurim, we're going to learn from meat. Now, why is the meat that's left overnight kasher? Well, that's completely kasher, because if it's a korban shlamim, you're allowed to eat the meat for the next day also. So now we're going to start from the end and go backwards. Since the meat, the day after, is actually, if it's left overnight, it's actually still good. Okay, if you're talking about a shlamim, obviously not a chatad or some of the others. But if the meat is left overnight, it's good in a shlamim. Therefore, in a case when you left the imurim, which you shouldn't have, because you're supposed to burn them by that night, that day or night, and you didn't, but if you accidentally put it on the altar, we'll leave it on. And since that's the case for the imurim, we'll say the same thing for the blood. And that's how it works, and it all comes from the fact that the meat is actually not disqualified. And we're going to do a very similar thing to yotze. If it leaves the azara, why is that going to be? If the meat, the imurim, leave the azara, or meat that's not supposed to leave, and comes back on, and then the imurim go on the altar, we're going to leave them on. It's right. The meat don't go on the altar, but if it's the imurim, I guess in a ola it would. Shayotze kasher bebama, because in the bamot, okay, I'm just reminding you, Rabbi Yehuda said, yotze of the blood is the problem, right? Let me just double check that. So he's not talking about the blood here. He's talking about the meat. If the meat goes out, why is that okay? Shayotze kasher bebama, because when they didn't have a temple and they were allowed to bring sacrifices elsewhere, well, yotze was not a disqualification because there is no area. You could just do it in your backyard. There's no area around where it's sanctified that it can't leave that area. So since it works when there's bamot, we're going to say it's obviously not a terrible disqualification. Okay, so we're going to have a problem with this whole thing. If you remember the sugya in Nun Aleph, if you don't, you'll see. But we actually reject all this because this makes no sense. But all these limudim. Tameh, ho'yavu hutar lavadat tzibur. Tuma, we always say this. Tuma has this weakness because meaning something that makes it not so terrible, because if the majority of the people are tameh and we're trying to do a communal offering, Tuma hutra b'tzibur, we allow things to be brought in impurity. So obviously, right, if the meat is impure, we allow it because we're going to allow it for the tzibur. Again, if the majority of whatever is impure. So again, there's a heter. Okay, now we're going to do a bit of a different type, which is chutz lizmano. This is always a hard concept to grasp, but we've seen it a bunch of times already. Hopefully you have it by now, which is in pigul. Let's just remember. Let's assume you slaughter it with a thought that you're going to sprinkle the blood in the wrong time. Okay, now that's pigul. But when are you obligated in pigul? When you eat the meat. But not only when you eat the meat, but only if you eat the meat after everything else was done properly, meaning if the blood was sprinkled properly. If they sprinkled the blood, then it will become pigul. If they ended up just not sprinkling the blood because the whole thing was disqualified, you won't be liable karet for eating the meat of that sacrifice. So what does that mean? That's what we call that the sprinkling of the blood is miratzel pigulo. It's almost, we'll call it like this. It's viewed as an actual sprinkling of the blood to the extent that this will now be called pigul because you actually sprinkle the blood. So even though you weren't allowed to sprinkle the blood, if you did it, it works to do ritzoy lepigulo. It's a bit of a weird word. Ritzoy usually means it's good. This is not good. This just means it's viewed like a good sprinkling to the extent that now we're going to obligate you for a pigul if you eat it. So that means that the sprinkling of the blood is considered a real action, almost like a real legit sprinkling of the blood. And therefore, we're going to say, must be that if you did chutz lizmano and you brought the blood on the altar, we leave it there. Okay? Chutzlim, again, it's a bit of a stretch a little there, but that's how they say it. Chutzlim kamohu yavi yitakish lechutz lizmano. Well, once we have chutz lizmano, then chutzlim kamo goes along with it, because we've learned a lot that they're similar. They're both learned from the same pasuk, different words in the same pasuk. But remember, chutzlim kamo is a little different than chutz lizmano, because chutz lizmano you actually get karet for eating the meat. Chutzlim kamo is just disqualified. You won't get karet, though, for eating the meat. But it's always compared in the pasuk because they appear in the same pasuk, so it's juxtaposed to that. So what's true for that will be true for that. So again, if these were put on the altar, they stay on. Shekiblu psulim v'zarku et amo. So before they explain where they get this from, they say b'hanach psulim, which psulim, and then you'll understand why it's on this list. Dechazu lovadat zibur. It's which psulim? It's kohanim that could do communal work if the majority of them are impure. If the majority of the kohanim become impure, then they're actually allowed to work in the temple. So again, that's a case where, if in a case where there wasn't this heter, there wasn't this permission because it wasn't tzibur and the majority of them weren't tameh, but they did it anyway, and they accepted the blood, they were disqualified on account of being impure, we'll allow that. Because again, we'll allow it to stay on the altar because it has this other heter situation, permitted situation. But now the Gemara rejects a lot of these answers, explanations. V'chidanim, this is, we had this on Nun Aleph. V'chidanim, davar shelo b'echshero mi-davar sheb'echshero. How can you learn something that's disqualified, like lam b'dam from, or lam b'imurim from lam b'dam, lam b'basal, from a thing that's completely mi-davar sheb'echshero? Right? What do we say? If the meat is left over, it's completely fine. And that's going to teach us that if the imurim, or the blood, which is not completely fine, which is totally disqualified, it was left overnight, but gets put on the altar, we'll leave it there. We learn it from a completely kosher case. How can you learn a completely disqualified case from a completely kosher case? Makes no sense. Same thing with yotze. In the bamot, it was totally permitted because there was no yotze. There was no boundaries. But here in the temple, it's disqualified. So how can you learn a disqualified case from a completely good case? To which the Gemara says, fine, you're right. He doesn't really learn it from here. Tana azot Torah ta'olah, riba samachle. He really learns it from the word zot Torah ta'olah, which again, we said is a word that comes to include. So if you're going to include, it's going to include these cases. And then again, he had the few that he just took out. And then the whole thing is, how do we remember this? Well, riba samachle, he just connected it to these cases to kind of remember as a mnemonic. But it's not that he really learned it from these cases, okay? It's not like he really learned a disqualified case from a non-disqualified case. That makes no sense. But once you have this, and that's why I even mentioned about how it sort of has a rhyme and a ring to it, it's a good way to remember. Lam bedam, because lam bimurim, because lam bebasal. Right? It's a good way to remember. And that's how you can remember the distinction that Rabbi Yehuda makes between the cases. But it's not like that's where he really gets it from. That doesn't really make any sense. And with that, we finish for today. We'll start with Rabbi Yochanan tomorrow because we really start a new issue within this. So we have today our two main topics. The one that really we started in yesterday's daf, which is these 5 opinions about which types of items get to stay on the altar if they were put on, and that was which type of item, not which type of disqualification. Today, the question became which type of disqualification. Okay, so when we finished up with which type of item, we were trying to figure out, right, which ones each of them agree with and disagree with about, all kinds of permutations of who agrees with who about which kinds of cases, and then kind of said, well, really why Reish Lakish do this? And then we gave 2 possible answers. The first one we rejected, then we ended up with, he was trying to teach us that Rabbi Shimon, even in a case where you bring the libations a few days later, they're still considered secondary to the korban. Then we got to this machloket between really Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon about which types of disqualified items stay on the altar, which Rabbi Shimon had the more inclusive list, whereas Rabbi Yehuda had these 3 exclusions from the pasuk, zot, he, and haolah, which excluded 3 other cases that he didn't agree with Rabbi Shimon about, but they both agreed about the roveh and nirba and all that. And then we brought a braita that kind of connected this all to psukim, even though in the end we said, well, some of these limudim in the braita were really just mnemonics, and it's not like they really got it from there, but it is a way to at least remember or connect it somehow to psukim, which gives it a little more strength, but, even if it's not directly learned out from there. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day and a good week.